Maria Santos had always been the smallest person in any room she entered. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing just 110 pounds, she looked more like a high school student than a trained military medic. Her fellow soldiers at the forward operating base in Afghanistan often joked that a strong wind could blow her away. Some called her tiny behind her back, though never with malice. They had grown fond of the quiet young woman from Texas who had surprised everyone by volunteering for combat duty. The daughter of immigrant farm workers, Maria had grown up picking vegetables in the scorching Texas sun alongside her parents and for siblings. While other kids complained about household chores, Maria was already working 12-hour days in the field by age 10. Her hands, though small, had developed a strength that belied her size from years of hauling heavy baskets of produce. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to community college, but Maria had other plans. She wanted to serve her country and earn money for her family at the same time. When she announced her intention to join the Army, her family was devastated. Her mother cried for days, begging her not to go. Her father, a man of few words, simply shook his head and walked away. They couldn't understand why their brilliant daughter, who had earned straight A's in pre-med courses, would throw away her future to become a soldier. But Maria had made up her mind. She wanted to be a combat medic, to save lives on the battlefield. Basic training had been brutal for someone her size. While her male counterparts easily hauled heavy equipment and completed obstacle courses, Maria struggled with every physical challenge. The drill sergeants pushed her harder than anyone else, expecting her to quit. She never did. When other recruits were sleeping, Maria was in the gym, building the strength she needed to keep up. When they were relaxing on weekends, she was studying medical procedures and battlefield tactics. Her determination caught the attention of Sergeant First Class Robert "Tank" Williams, a massive man who stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed over 200 pounds. Tank was a career soldier with 15 years of experience and multiple combat deployments. He had earned his nickname not just for his size, but for his ability to plow through any obstacle in his path. Initially skeptical of having such a small medic in his unit, Tank gradually developed a grudging respect for Maria's tenacity and skill. The forward operating base in Kandahar province was Maria's first deployment, and she had been there for 8 months. The base was situated in hostile territory, surrounded by mountains where enemy fighters could easily observe their movements. Supply convoys were frequently attacked, and casualties were a daily reality. Maria had already treated dozens of wounded soldiers, proving her competence under fire despite the doubts of some veterans. The relationship between Maria and Tank was complicated. He was protective of all his soldiers, but especially worried about Maria's safety in such a dangerous environment. She, in turn, was determined to prove that she belonged there and didn't need special treatment. Their professional respect was mutual, but Tank still couldn't shake the feeling that someone so small had no business in a combat zone. On the morning of September 15th, 2018, intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the region. Tank's squad was assigned to accompany a supply convoy through a particularly dangerous mountain pass, known as Ambush Alley by the troops. The route was the only way to reach a remote outpost that desperately needed medical supplies and ammunition. Maria was assigned to the mission as the squad's medic, carrying her medical kit and a rifle she hoped she wouldn't need to use. The convoy consisted of 4 heavily armored vehicles carrying essential supplies. Tank Squad was responsible for providing security in the lead vehicle, while Maria rode in the second truck with the medical supplies she might need if casualties occurred. The mountain road was narrow and winding, with steep cliffs on one side and rocky walls on the other. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and everyone in the convoy knew it. As they entered the mountain pass, the mood in the vehicles became tense. Radio chatter was minimal, with drivers focusing intently on navigating the treacherous road while gunners scanned the surrounding hills for signs of enemy movement. Maria checked her medical supplies for the 3rd time, mentally rehearsing the trauma procedures she might need to perform. She had learned to stay calm under pressure, but something about this mission felt different. Tank, riding in the lead vehicle, was constantly communicating with his team and monitoring radio traffic from base. His experience told him that an attack was imminent, but he couldn't pinpoint when or where it would come. The enemy fighters in this region were skilled and patient, often waiting for the perfect moment to strike when the convoy was most vulnerable. The attack came without warning as the convoy rounded a sharp bend in the road. The lead vehicle, carrying Tank and 3 other soldiers, struck a buried, improvised explosive device that had been carefully hidden in the roadway. The massive explosion flipped the armored truck and sent it tumbling down a rocky embankment. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows in the other vehicles and temporarily deafened everyone in the convoy. The explosion had been so sudden and violent that for several seconds, nobody in the remaining vehicles could process what had happened. Through the ringing in her ears, Maria heard the commander of the second vehicle shouting into his radio, trying to establish contact with Tank's team. There was no response except static. Black smoke billowed from the wreckage below, and the acrid smell of burning fuel and metal filled the air. Enemy fighters immediately opened fire from concealed positions in the rocks above the road. Bullets struck the armored vehicles with metallic pings, forcing the surviving soldiers to take cover. The convoy was trapped in a kill zone, unable to move forward or backward without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. The narrow mountain road offered no escape routes, and the steep terrain made it impossible for rescue vehicles to quickly reach their position. Maria's vehicle commander, Lieutenant Johnson, was trying to coordinate a response while under heavy fire. The priority was to establish security and call for air support, but they also needed to determine if there were any survivors in the destroyed lead vehicle. Through her binoculars, Maria could see movement near the wreckage. Someone was alive down there, but it was impossible to tell how many or how badly they were injured. The enemy fire was too intense for an immediate rescue attempt. The surviving soldiers established defensive positions behind their vehicles and returned fire, trying to suppress the enemy long enough to plan a rescue operation. Maria remained in her vehicle, monitoring radio frequencies and preparing her medical equipment for what she knew would be a challenging casualty evacuation under fire. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the enemy fire began to decrease. The fighters were likely repositioning or running low on ammunition. This was the opportunity the soldiers had been waiting for. Lieutenant Johnson made the decision to send a small team down to check on survivors while the remaining troops provided covering fire from above. Maria immediately volunteered to be part of the rescue team. Her small size would make her a harder target, and her medical training was essential if there were wounded soldiers below. Lieutenant Johnson initially refused, arguing that the mission was too dangerous for someone of her size and experience. But Maria was persistent, pointing out that any injured soldiers would need immediate medical attention that only she could provide. The descent to the wreckage was treacherous. The rocky slope was steep and unstable, with loose stones that could easily cause a fall. Maria and 2 other soldiers rappelled down using ropes, their movement slow and careful to avoid creating noise that might attract enemy attention. Every few feet, they paused to listen for sound from the wreckage or signs that enemy fighters were moving to new positions. When they reached the destroyed vehicle, the scene was worse than Maria had imagined. The armored truck had rolled several times before coming to rest upside down against a large boulder. The roof was partially caved in, and one side was torn open by the explosion. Fuel was leaking from the ruptured tank, creating a constant fire hazard. The smell of smoke, fuel, and something else Maria didn't want to identify made it difficult to breathe. 2 soldiers from the lead vehicle were found immediately. Private First Class Davis had been thrown clear during the explosion and was unconscious with obvious head trauma and multiple fractures. Specialist Rodriguez had been trapped under heavy equipment, but was alert and responsive, though his legs appeared to be badly crushed. Both men needed immediate evacuation to survive their injuries. Tank was found pinned under the overturned vehicle, conscious but in obvious pain. A large piece of the truck's armor plating had fallen across his chest and legs, and he was unable to free himself. Blood trickled from a head wound, and his breathing was labored, suggesting possible internal injuries. Despite his condition, his first words to Maria were asking about the status of his other men and whether enemy fighters were still in the area. The fourth member of the team, Corporal Stevens, had not survived the explosion. Maria confirmed his death and said a brief prayer before focusing on the living. Tank was the most seriously injured of the survivors, but he was also the largest and heaviest. Getting him out would require lifting the armored plating, which weighed several hundred pounds. Even with 3 people working together, it seemed like an impossible task. The rescue team tried various methods to free Tank, using crowbars and leverage points to lift the heavy metal. But their efforts were hampered by the unstable wreckage and the constant threat of enemy fire. Every few minutes, bullets would whistle overhead, forcing them to take cover and interrupt their rescue attempts. Time was running out, and Tank's condition was deteriorating. Lieutenant Johnson's voice crackled over the radio, reporting that enemy reinforcements had been spotted moving through the mountains. Air support was still 20 minutes away, and a larger enemy force could overrun their position before help arrived. The decision was made to evacuate the 2 soldiers who could be moved immediately and return for Tank once air support had cleared the area. Maria refused to leave Tank behind. She argued that his injuries were too severe to wait for another rescue attempt, and that he would likely die before they could return. The other soldiers pointed out that staying behind would mean certain death for everyone if enemy fighters reached their position. But Maria had made her decision. She would stay with Tank and find a way to get him out, regardless of the odds against success. The other members of the rescue team reluctantly began their ascent back up the rocky slope, carrying the 2 wounded soldiers who could be moved. Maria watched them disappear into the rocks above, knowing that she had just committed herself to what many would consider a suicide mission. She was now alone in hostile territory with a severely injured soldier who outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds, trapped under heavy debris that she couldn't possibly lift by herself. Tank tried to convince her to leave with the others. Through gritted teeth, he told her that she was throwing her life away for nothing, that he was probably going to die anyway from his internal injuries. But Maria had seen something in his eyes that he probably didn't realize he was showing, a flicker of hope that someone cared enough not to abandon him. She had made similar promises to her family back in Texas, and she wasn't about to break her word now. The first thing Maria did was assess Tank's injuries more thoroughly. His breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, and she suspected he had several broken ribs that might be puncturing his lungs. The head wound was bleeding steadily, and his pupils were slightly dilated, indicating a possible concussion. Most critically, his legs were completely pinned under the armored plating, and she could see that one foot was turned at an unnatural angle. Working quickly but carefully, Maria began treating Tank's most immediate injuries. She cleaned and bandaged the head wound, administered pain medication from her medical kit, and started in 4 to replace fluids he was losing from internal bleeding. All of this had to be done while lying on her side in the cramped space next to the overturned vehicle, with bullets occasionally striking the metal above them. The armored plating that trapped Tank's legs weighed approximately 300 pounds according to his estimate. Maria had lifted heavy objects before, but nothing close to that weight. Her experience in the Texas fields had taught her about leverage and mechanical advantage, but the confined space and unstable wreckage limited her options. She needed to find a way to lift or shift the metal without causing the entire wreck to collapse further. Using pieces of debris and Tank's own rifle as leverage points, Maria began experimenting with different approaches to free his legs. Each attempt required enormous physical effort from someone her size, and progress was measured in inches rather than feet. The work was exhausting, and sweat dripped into her eyes as she strained against the unyielding metal. Tank watched her efforts with growing amazement and concern. After an hour of unsuccessful attempts, Maria realized that she needed to change her strategy completely. Instead of trying to lift the heavy plating straight up, she needed to find a way to pivot it or slide it sideways. This would require creating a fulcrum point and using her entire body weight as leverage. The physics were challenging, but it was her only realistic option. The sound of gunfire from above indicated that enemy fighters were still active in the area, and radio chatter suggested that more hostile forces were moving toward their position. Maria knew that time was running critically short. If she couldn't free Tank within the next hour, they would both likely be captured or killed when enemy reinforcements arrived. Tank's condition was also deteriorating. His breathing had become more labored, and he was showing signs of shock from blood loss and trauma. Maria gave him more pain medication and continued to pour fluids, but she knew that her medical supplies were limited. Without proper surgical facilities, Tank's internal injuries would eventually prove fatal even if she managed to free him from the wreckage. The breakthrough came when Maria noticed that one end of the armored plating was resting on a loose piece of the vehicle's frame. If she could shift that supporting piece just a few inches, the entire weight distribution would change, potentially allowing her to slide the plating sideways rather than lifting it directly. The plan was dangerous because moving the wrong piece could cause the entire wreck to shift and crush them both. Working with extreme care, Maria used her crowbar to gradually adjust the position of the supporting frame piece. Each small movement caused the wreckage to creak and groan ominously, and several times she had to stop when debris shifted overhead. Tank remained conscious throughout the process, offering encouragement and advice despite his pain and fear. When the frame piece finally moved into the right position, Maria felt the weight distribution change immediately. The armored plating was now balanced differently, with most of its weight supported by the frame rather than Tank's legs. This was her opportunity, but she would only get one chance. If the plating slipped back into its original position, she might not be able to recreate the same leverage again. Using every ounce of strength she possessed, Maria pushed against the armored plating while simultaneously pulling Tank toward her. The metal moved slowly at first, then more quickly as momentum built. Tank gritted his teeth and helped as much as he could, using his arms to pull himself free while Maria maintained pressure on the heavy plating. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Tank's legs came free. Both of them were exhausted from the effort, and Tank was clearly in severe pain, but he was finally free from the wreckage. However, Maria quickly realized that freeing him was only the beginning of their challenges. They were still trapped in hostile territory with enemy forces approaching, and Tank was in no condition to walk or climb back up to the road. Tank's legs were severely injured from being trapped under the heavy armored plating. His right ankle was clearly broken, twisted at an angle that made Maria wince, and his left leg had deep lacerations that were bleeding heavily. Even if he could somehow bear weight on his injuries, the steep rocky slope back to the road would be impossible for him to climb in his condition. The alternative routes through the mountains were even more treacherous and would take them directly through areas known to be controlled by enemy fighters. Maria made a quick assessment of their situation. They had limited medical supplies, no heavy equipment for moving an injured person, and enemy forces were approaching their location. The radio had gone silent from the convoy above, which could mean that her fellow soldiers had been forced to retreat or were engaged in heavy fighting. Air support was still somewhere overhead, but she couldn't establish communication from their position in the wreckage. Tank looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. He knew as well as she did that his chances of surviving an evacuation were minimal. He had lost a significant amount of blood, and his breathing indicated possible internal injuries that required immediate surgery. Even if they could somehow get him back to the road, the journey to the nearest field hospital would take hours that he might not have. But Maria had not come this far to give up now. She remembered her father's words from her childhood. Mija, when you commit to something, you see it through to the end, no matter how hard it gets. She had committed to getting Tank out alive, and she intended to keep that promise regardless of what it took. The question was how to move a 200-pound injured man across miles of hostile territory when she weighed barely half as much. The solution came from an unexpected source. Among the debris scattered around the crash site, Maria found a section of canvas tarp that had been used to cover supplies in the vehicle. The material was heavy-duty and designed to withstand rough handling. If she could fashion it into a makeshift stretcher or drag sled, she might be able to pull Tank rather than trying to carry or support his weight. Working quickly, Maria gathered additional materials from the wreckage. She found several lengths of rope, some metal supports that could serve as handles, and pieces of padding that could make the journey slightly more comfortable for Tank. The improvised stretcher wouldn't win any awards for medical design, but it was sturdy enough to support his weight and had attachment points where she could secure pulling straps. Tank watched her preparations with growing disbelief. Even with the makeshift stretcher, the physical demands of dragging him across mountainous terrain would be enormous for someone her size. The route back to friendly territory was approximately 8 miles through rocky, uneven ground with numerous obstacles and elevation changes. It would challenge a team of healthy soldiers, let alone one small medic working alone. Maria helped Tank onto the improvised stretcher, carefully positioning him to minimize pressure on his injured legs while ensuring that he was securely fastened for the journey ahead. She checked his vital signs one more time and administered additional pain medication, knowing that the trip would be extremely uncomfortable regardless of her efforts to make him stable. Before beginning their journey, Maria explained her plan to Tank. Rather than attempting the direct route back to the road, where they would almost certainly encounter enemy forces, she intended to take a longer path through a narrow canyon that led toward a different mountain pass. Intelligence reports suggested that this route was less heavily patrolled, though it would add several miles to their journey and require crossing difficult terrain. Tank tried one more time to convince her to abandon him and save herself. He pointed out that she could easily slip away through the mountains and reach friendly lines within a few hours if she traveled alone. Staying with him meant risking both their lives for what might ultimately be a futile effort. But Maria had made her decision, and no amount of logical argument was going to change her mind. The first few hundred yards were the most difficult as Maria learned to manage the weight and momentum of the stretcher on uneven ground. Tank tried to help by using his arms to push against rocks and tree roots, but his injuries limited how much assistance he could provide. The canvas tarp proved more durable than expected, sliding relatively smoothly over rocky surfaces while protecting Tank from the worst impacts. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Maria developed a rhythm for the journey. She would pull steadily for 10 or 15 minutes, then stop to rest and check on Tank's condition. The work was exhausting, and her shoulders and back ached from the constant strain of pulling his weight. Sweat soaked through her uniform despite the cool mountain air, and her hands developed blisters from gripping the rope handles. The terrain varied from smooth canyon floor to rocky inclines that required careful navigation. Several times, Maria had to partially lift and carry the stretcher over obstacles that were too large or steep to drag across. These sections demanded enormous physical effort and precise coordination to avoid dropping Tank or losing control of the stretcher on steep slopes. Enemy activity in the area became apparent when they heard helicopters overhead and the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the mountains. Maria realized that search parties were likely looking for survivors from a convoy attack, which meant that their window of opportunity for escape was closing rapidly. They needed to reach friendly territory before enemy patrols expanded their search to include the canyon route. Tank's condition fluctuated throughout the journey. Sometimes he was alert and conversational, offering encouragement and sharing stories from his military career to help pass the time. Other periods saw him drift in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently as pain medication and blood loss affected his awareness. Maria monitored his pulse and breathing constantly, adjusting his position and administering fluids whenever they stopped to rest. The most challenging obstacle came approximately halfway through their journey, when they encountered a steep rocky incline that rose nearly 50 feet above the canyon floor. The stretcher couldn't be dragged up such a slope, and Maria wasn't strong enough to carry Tank's full weight vertically. She spent over an hour searching for an alternative route before finding a narrow ledge that switchbacked up the rock face. Navigating the ledge required Maria to position herself below the stretcher and essentially push Tank upward while maintaining her own footing on the narrow path. One slip would send both of them tumbling back down to the canyon floor. The ascent took nearly 2 hours and left Maria completely exhausted, but they successfully reached the top of the incline and could continue their journey towards safety. After 8 hours of continuous effort, Maria was approaching the limits of human endurance. Her small frame had been pushed far beyond what anyone would have thought possible, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest with each step. The rope handles had cut deep grooves into her palms despite her gloves, and her shoulders felt like they were on fire from the constant strain of pulling Tank's weight across the unforgiving mountain terrain. Tank had been drifting in and out of consciousness for the past 2 hours, and his vital signs were becoming increasingly unstable. His pulse was rapid and weak, indicating severe blood loss and shock, while his breathing had become shallow and irregular. Maria knew that his internal injuries were worsening, and without immediate surgical intervention, he would not survive much longer regardless of whether they reached safety. The canyon route had proven longer and more difficult than Maria had anticipated. What she had estimated as an 8-mile journey had stretched to nearly 12 miles due to detours around impassable obstacles and the winding nature of the mountain paths. Darkness was beginning to fall, which would provide cover from enemy patrols, but make navigation treacherous on the rocky terrain. As they crested a ridge overlooking a valley, Maria finally saw something that gave her hope. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, she could make out the lights of a forward operating base. It was a smaller installation than their original base, but it would have medical facilities and communication equipment. More importantly, it was within friendly territory where they would be safe from enemy forces. The final descent into the valley was the most challenging part of their entire journey. The slope was steep and covered with loose rocks that shifted underfoot with every step. Maria had to use every technique she had learned about controlling the stretcher's momentum to prevent it from sliding out of control and potentially injuring Tank further. Several times, she had to brace herself against boulders to stop their downward slide and reposition for a safer approach. Tank regained consciousness as they entered the valley floor, and for the first time in hours, he was fully alert and aware of their surroundings. He could see the lights of the base ahead and realized that Maria had somehow accomplished what everyone, including himself, had considered impossible. A 110-pound medic had single-handedly dragged a 200-pound injured soldier across 12 miles of hostile mountain terrain. With the base now clearly visible, Maria found reserves of energy she didn't know she still possessed. The final mile passed in what felt like a blur of determination and adrenaline. Tank tried to stay conscious to help guide their approach and watch for sentries who might mistake them for enemy infiltrators approaching in the darkness. The base's perimeter guards spotted them when they were still several hundred yards away. Through night vision equipment, they could see a small figure dragging what appeared to be a casualty across the open ground. Initially suspicious that it might be an enemy trick, the guards maintained defensive positions while calling for their commanding officer to assess the situation. Maria was too exhausted to call out when she saw the base defenses ahead, but Tank managed to summon enough strength to shout identification codes and request immediate medical assistance. His voice, though weak, carried the unmistakable accent and terminology of an American soldier, convincing the guards that they were dealing with friendly forces. Medical personnel from the base reached them within minutes of their identification. A team of medics and doctors immediately began treating Tank's injuries while others attended to Maria, who had collapsed from exhaustion the moment she realized they had reached safety. Both of them were quickly transported to the base's medical facility for emergency treatment. Tank required immediate surgery to address internal bleeding and repair damage to his legs and ribs. The medical team was amazed that he had survived the journey given the severity of his injuries, crediting Maria's field treatment and quick evacuation with saving his life. The surgeons worked through the night to stabilize his condition, and while his recovery would take months, they were confident that he would make a full recovery. Maria suffered from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and numerous cuts and bruises from their journey through the mountains. Her hands required treatment for deep rope burns, and her shoulders and back showed signs of extreme muscle strain. However, her injuries were relatively minor compared to what she had accomplished, and she was released from medical care after 24 hours of rest and observation. News of Maria's extraordinary rescue spread quickly through military communications networks. The story of a tiny medic dragging a massive sergeant for 12 miles through enemy territory captured the imagination of soldiers throughout the region. Fellow troops who had previously questioned her presence in a combat zone now spoke of her with genuine respect and admiration. Tank made a point of publicly crediting Maria with saving his life when he was well enough to speak to visitors. He told anyone who would listen that she had refused to abandon him when logic and military doctrine suggested that staying behind was futile. Her determination and physical courage had transformed an impossible situation into a successful rescue mission. The military hierarchy took notice of Maria's actions as well. She was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, making her one of the youngest recipients of such a high honor. The citation specifically mentioned her extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication to her fellow soldiers in the face of overwhelming odds and extreme personal danger. More importantly for Maria, Tank made a complete recovery from his injuries. After months of rehabilitation, he returned to active duty and continued his military career. The two of them maintained a close friendship built on the shared experience of that terrible day in the mountains when everything went wrong, but somehow turned out right because one person refused to give up. When Maria returned home to Texas after her deployment, her family finally understood why she had chosen military service over college. Her mother, who had cried when Maria enlisted, now spoke proudly of her daughter's courage to anyone who would listen. Her father, still a man of few words, simply hugged her tightly and said he was proud of the woman she had become. The story became a legend within military circles, proving that heroism comes in all sizes and that determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Maria Santos, the small medic from Texas who nobody believed could handle combat duty, had shown that the size of someone's heart matters far more than the size of their body when lives are on the line.